We knew each other way back in HP, very early in both our careers.
Yeah.
So his interests have been in collaborative systems, in multimedia, and in personal information management. And currently, he's very interested in digital tools to help us remember and to share our memories. And that's what he's going to talk to us about today. Particularly, he has recently been elected to the CHI Academy, which is the set of people who've had distinguished careers in human-computer interaction. And so, Steve?
Yeah, thanks very much.
Oh, and if people have questions, either I'll come with a microphone or there's a microphone there because it's being videotaped, plus there are people remotely. So please remember to use the mic for any questions you have.
Okay, and I am actually happy to take questions at any point. So if the logistics get a bit hard, I'll just repeat the question. Right. Okay, I want to talk about a quite pervasive vision about what our futures are going to be like. And just to make some rhetorical points, I'm actually going to slightly misrepresent the main protagonist. But I'm doing that in good faith because I'm basically trying to explore some of the consequences of this particular, the vision that they're proposing. So there's been a lot of interest in a set of papers coming out of Microsoft by Gordon Bell and Jim Gemmell, who are basically arguing for this so-called My Life Bits vision. And the idea is quite simple. What they're saying is, what would happen if we could save records of every single piece of information we touched and every event that we experienced? And what we'd have in consequence is a complete and accurate digital record of everything we ever did or felt or experienced. And what they're doing is they're drawing a strong contrast with our organic memories. And you don't have to reflect very hard. Probably all of you have had at least one incident so far today where you've forgotten something or not done something. So this is highly prevalent that we get these behaviors which show that our own wetware memories are fallible. And so this vision is quite enticing in contrast to that. And I'm going to run through this because it's kind of standard stuff. Basically, this is the bigger, faster, smaller, cheaper set of slides, right? So it basically says, this is all changing. It's getting easier to store this stuff. It's getting cheaper to store it. And move on to just some back-of-the-envelope calculations about how plausible all this would be. So we can just do some back-of-the-envelope calculations which look at how much speech we consume and how much text we consume. And basically, if you think about the storage, this is pitiful, right, compared with what we've got on a laptop. Now, it's about 6 gig, right? That's just speech and text from television and stuff we read. And if you want to get a bit fancier and you think about making kind of style statements about walking around with video cameras on your head like these cyborgs at MIT do, then you're still not looking, this is not prohibitive, right? This is perfectly possible that we could imagine video, if you videotaped an entire life, that's the speech, video. This is completely plausible that, in a few years' time, that won't be prohibitive as an amount of information that we carry around and store. You've only got to reflect back on those Moore's law type curves. You've got to think about, how much, you can get a 6 gig memory stick for next to nothing now. And that would have been prohibitive even 5 years ago. And this is basically what Gordon Bell's doing. Gordon's the alpha user, and he's just storing his whole life. And it's interesting, actually, and I'll come back to this point, Gordon needs 2 assistants to help him store his life, right? Because it's quite effortful to do all this. But he's not the only person who's interested in this type of vision. There's a set of very interesting papers come out of Microsoft. They've built a desktop search tool. As far as I understand it, the first cross-format desktop search tool. There's some infrastructure tools from MIT. Those are kind of generic capture technologies. In the mobile domain, you can tag life events by location. This is very old work. It's 10 or 12 years old. You can tag events by visual characteristics. You all know the Microsoft SenseCam. It's basically a digital camera that you wear around your neck, but it's actually triggered by your behaviors. So if I was to turn in this room, then what would happen is that the lighting, which is sensed by the camera, would change, so a picture would be taken. If I was to leave the room, same thing, a picture would be taken. If I was to change my posture, another picture would be taken. So basically what this is doing is laying down a series of image-oriented and time-stamped events for everything that you do. And there's also people, the MIT people have built ubiquitous speech capture, and we have some tools that we've developed in this domain. And then more specifically, there are certain fora, like, for example, at lectures or meetings, where people have built dedicated tools which are intended to extract meaningful events from ubiquitous recording. So this type of technology is, for example, interested in extracting action items from meetings automatically or decisions from meetings. And if people are interested in that, I can talk to them about that because it's much harder than it looks. Okay, so that's the kind of background. And the press, in particular, seems to have gone completely bonkers about this. So they're saying things like, humankind's strategy has been to rely less and less on actually remembering, more and more on being able to find something when we need it. The Gospels, Gutenberg, and Google, and here I am today, have all been steps along the way. So your history, basically, this is what it's going to be in the future. So what I want to do in this talk is basically try and examine some of the repercussions of this type of technology and what might actually happen if we had these types of archives. So the rest of the talk, what I want to do is I want to talk about some of the problems with the vision as stated, and then I'll talk about some of the work that we've been doing recently, which is trying to develop different design principles for what I call computer-mediated memory. I don't like the term digital memories for reasons that will become obvious later. In particular, I want to make the argument that these are prostheses which sit alongside our organic memory and have to work with it, right? And I'll present some arguments and systems and data which support that perspective. And then I'll talk about various systems that we've been building which are developed according to these types of principles and conclude with some future challenges. Okay, so what I want to start off by talking about is some experiments that we've done over the last few years which have looked at various problems associated with these types of archives. And the first thing I want to talk about is that in some sense, this type of archive is invisible to people. And I'll explain what I mean in a minute. I'll also say that, talk about some studies we've done on having people try and find old pictures, which show that they're considerably less successful than they might have anticipated at finding pictures. And then it's a pity Rick Boardman's not here because I could have talked to him about some of the things that we do when we're trying to organize our own PIM-type stuff, which are kind of counterproductive in various ways. Okay, so I'll talk about a study that we've just done, which is looking. So one of the things that we're interested in when we're trying to think about the design of digital mementos was, well, what in general is a good memento, right? Forget about the digital for a minute. What about, for an ordinary person, what's a kind of really major, significant object? So what we did was we got a bunch of people who were, they were families with relatively young children, because we thought, well, these are people who are actually, they self-described curators of their children's lives, right? So what they're trying to do is they're trying to build up an archive of stuff that they can hand on to their kids, right? So this is, it's very self-aware when they're doing this. So what we did was we got them to do the equivalent of a kind of PIM tour. The PIM tour is where you say, here's your desktop, here's the user's desktop. Now you have the user walk you through it. Oh, these are my files, they're organized like this. These are all my emails, right? So what we did was we had them do a home tour, and we had them pick around 10 objects and talk about why they picked those objects and why those objects had mnemonic significance. Okay, guess how many digital objects people picked? None. We've got a none. That's not quite right. It's a little bit low. Any advances on none? 3. Okay, that's too high. The answer is 1. Okay. Less than 1%, right? So it's 1 out of about 160 objects that were chosen. So this we found very surprising. I say this, I mean, you're not surprised. I guess I primed you for that expectation. But we found this rather surprising because what we saw when people were walking through these houses is we saw them walking past computers, we saw them walking past racks of CDs, and we saw them, they've got all their digital stuff organized in a particular place, they've got the machines all over the house, but they're not talking about digital stuff, right?
So if they had gone to a picture on the wall that was clearly a photograph and could have been a digital, would you have counted that as digital?
Absolutely, absolutely. So we asked about all the pictures, is that a printout of something that had been digital? And the answer was, most of the pictures were things that were taken that were analog. Now, the next thing to think about is this some kind of recency problem, right, that the significant mementos are things from a long time back. So what we did was we looked at the average age of their digital archive and we compared it with the age of the objects that were selected. And rather surprisingly, the physical mementos they pick tend to be relatively recent. So their kind of mean age or modal age is around 2 years for that stuff. And that may be because they're parents of young children, so they've got a lot of stuff in there about, if you like, what we call memories in progress. The other thing is, you can say, oh, well, in some sense, it's in the computer and it's sort of, hard to get out. Well, I guess that's kind of our point in a sense. But what we did see, this is a memory box down here. And these are very common, right? A lot of the things that people talk about are these kind of collections that they've stashed away in a kind of secret place. And what people would do in this case is they might actually say, oh, hang on, and they walk across one room and they go into the back of a cupboard, pull out a drawer, and they pull this thing out, right? Okay, and so I think that's a fair comparison if you're thinking about digital stuff in terms of its, that is clearly not on the surface and viewable, like some of these things. I mean, you walk into people's living rooms or whatever, and you say, okay, well, give me some, let's talk about mementos, and they say, well, there's that and that. So these are things in full and plain sight, but, at least, I can't remember what proportion as I say, most people have got one of these, but these are things that they actually have to actively, think about and retrieve. Dan?
How many of those items selected were photo books?
So albums, right? Okay. So the question is, how many have we got? Any? Oh, we have one. Okay. So, so how many of those things were photo albums or photo books? The proportion, I can't answer that, but I can answer in terms of proportion of photos. That was small compared with what we expected. So we thought the kind of quintessential memento is the photograph, right? Like the wedding photograph, the, christening photograph, the kids, whatever. And what we found was that photographs, I think, were about 20% overall, but they weren't the most popular type of item. Most people had some kind of album. But anyway, so the most striking thing in terms of the types of objects chosen was that a lot of these things were kind of strange, slightly strange physical objects, right? So there's one guy who was talking about, these are shells, by the way, I should have explained that. Every time this family goes on holiday in the summer, they go down to the beach, they collect a bunch of shells, and these are labeled by year. Other examples of these kind of interesting objects were things like one guy had his father had recently died before the kids were born, and so what he'd done was he got various objects that were his dad's, and the kids were using them, right? Like a bunch of keys that they were using, a step ladder. Another person had, she went and she produced this coffee mug, which is completely unusable because it was sort of held together by, various gluings, right? And this mug's 20 years old, right? So these are things like, you actually need the person there to subjectively interpret them before you can see they have any meaning. So it's not just something you can kind of walk up to and see the point of. So photos, sorry, I'm digressing a little, but photos are not the most frequent thing that was picked. Okay, so that's things, right? And the point about that study is that things, digital things weren't selected. I mean, we actually designed this study because what we expected was a good proportion of things that were picked were going to be digital. And what we wanted to do was to compare the physical and the digital. And we've since done another study where we've had them explicitly talk about their digital memories, which, if people are interested, I can talk about at the end. Okay, so let's talk about pictures now, since we had a question about pictures. Okay, so most of the stuff that's been done on digital pictures has been on relatively recent pictures. So there's been some very interesting work done, a lot of it in the UK actually, looking at people retrieving, talking about, sharing digital pictures. We did same kind of target population because we know they're motivated to collect this stuff and talk about it. And we basically had this kind of setup interview where we asked them about their digital archives. And, they come out with these statements like, this is the most important thing in our house. If the house is burning down, we take this out straight away, kind of thing. Then what we did was we talked to them about things that had happened in their life that were kind of noteworthy or event-worthy, because these are things that people tend to take a picture of. Right, at this point, we said to them, we're really interested in seeing images of those types of events. We hadn't told them the point of the study before. Now, can we go to your computer, and can you find a picture, any picture, not just the best picture, any picture of that event, right? So these are named events for these people. They're salient events for these people. So we might say, OK, then, I don't know whether you had some fantastic bike ride that you're really proud of in the last 3 years, and you'd talk about that, and we'd say, OK, then we'll find me a picture of the Cross Ohio bike race, or whatever, the Great Ohio Bike Race. Yeah. OK, and Robin also asked for some pictures of my kids. There's Ewan unpacking his Christmas stuff, right? But he's a lot bigger than that now. OK, so we might say to them, find a picture of your child's first day at school. OK, next bit of audience participation. How many did they get right? What proportion of correct pictures, what proportion of pictures did they find? 40, good. OK, any advance on 40? No, you go for none. You've heard it before, haven't you? 40 is a bit low. And oh, well, OK, well, we'll just go with it, right? So it's about 61%. And these people, it's interesting, they're absolutely gutted, right? So you get these kind of reactions, these people, they spent all this time taking all this time invested in taking all these kind of memories, and they find that they can't retrieve these things. So what we did was we probed a little bit more to try and find out the reasons for this. And then what you find is that basically the practice of digital picture taking has just completely transformed in the last 10 years. And in a sense, people's organizational methods have not caught up with it, because we can't do search on this stuff, right? Well, maybe you're going to tell me we really can, but I would be rather surprised if somebody wants to tell me you can do search on this kind of stuff. So what's happened is people have shifted from, you think about the old days of the physical rolls, it's 3 to 5 rolls a year kind of thing, right? So I don't know whether that's 36 rolls. So that's the kind of numbers. We're looking at these people, and it's quite hard to get an accurate estimate for reasons I'll go into in a minute. But, we're talking about, around 5,000 pictures on average, which I felt was low, right? I know people who've got 20,000 digital pictures. So one of the problems is you've just got too much stuff. The other problem is that it's extremely poorly organized, right? So here's a typical, now you're probably all going to tell me that you're really organized with your pictures, right? That's normally what people do. Well, I'll tell you what happens with these users is they're just about to go away somewhere on holiday, on vacation, right? And they suddenly remember the camera's full. So what they do is they pull the stick out, and let's hope it's not an 8-gig stick, right? They pull the stick out, and they put it in the computer while they're still packing, and they say, OK, whatever the computer wants to call that folder, that's what it's going to be, right? And it may have, and of course, we don't take one stick's worth at an event. What happens is that those are mixed events inside a particular folder. So you get this kind of bizarre, I don't know whether you can read this, but here's an example of one of our users. But you get this mixture of these are kind of computer-defined indices, right? So those are dates, and then we've got semantics in here, family and friends. We've got particular events, London to Brighton. That's a bike race, big theme here, Robin. And then we've got kind of mixed ones, which are a place, Chatsworth, and an event. OK, and the other problem is that people falsely believed that because it was their stuff, and I've actually had a discussion with my wife in the last 2 days about this particular, who asserted quite confidently, and I proved her wrong, unusually, that she would be able to find anything, right? And the thing is that we are used to dealing with much smaller collections, paper collections, where it's an order of magnitude smaller, and people just believe falsely that they will be able to find this because it's their stuff, and they remember the event in some sense, right? But the reality is that that's not what happens. And here's, you've probably read this, So these people were we actually had to debrief them in this experiment. We had to sort of say to them, it's okay, you can't, honestly, you can't find your stuff, but we've talked about 15 other people in there in exactly the same situation, right? Okay, so then then the other thing is that we sometimes do things with this. So this is more kind of work-oriented information, but you see the same kind of pattern. We sometimes engage in organizational behaviors which turn out to be counterproductive. So, you probably all know this kind of stuff, right? People don't use web bookmarks, but they still like to make a lot, and they like to organize them a lot. But if you look at the most frequent way that people get back to stuff, right, ignoring the back, right? Well, we know back's a problem with post data, but we won't get into this, right? But the most frequent way to retrieve stuff is not via bookmarks, right? There are other ways that people used to do that, but people are still kind of religiously constructing quite arcane structures around bookmarks. Now, I don't know how you actually do the cost-benefit analysis here, right? I think that's an interesting question for research, is to say, well, if it's really, really important and I invested this amount of time in it, is that time worth spending? I don't know exactly how that analysis should go. But certainly it's the case that a lot of the things we do don't seem to be productive. And I've done work in the past which has looked at folder organizations in email. And what you find is that, and other people have replicated this within the last few years, that, basically a significant proportion of your folders aren't really doing anything functional for you, right? Because you really want a folder to contain some reasonable number, let's say 10, 15, I don't know what the exact number is, but certainly not 2, because at one level, if it just contained 1, all you've done is given yourself one extra thing to remember, right, when you're actually trying to file stuff. OK, and what we found was more folders, more failed folders. So the term in psychology is metacognition, and that what this means is that we engage in effort. We don't understand, if you like, how our tools are working, so we engage in efforts that, in this case, aren't necessarily that productive. OK, let's talk a little bit about desktop search. So Sue Dumais and Ed Cuttrell have written a couple of papers where they're basically starting to argue that PIM, personal information management, is a problem which is just going to disappear, right? Because we'll be able to search for stuff. So we've just done a study with around 700 users where we've looked at 4 different desktop search engines. And the question we've been asking is, how often do people use desktop search to find stuff? OK, any estimates? 10, all right, yep. Any advance on 10? Have you done the study? OK.
7.
Yeah, OK, so it's right. So it's 4 to 16. this is compared with navigation. The difference between that is people are using shortcuts and stuff like that and putting stuff on the desktop. But what we found was, which I found very surprising, especially for the Apple stuff, is that we've got Sherlock and Spotlight, and I don't know how much Apple invested in improving the search engine. We've got no difference in the percentage of searches based on that. What we saw was with Google Desktop, so we did a longitudinal study where we had people using it for a year. What we saw was initial increased around 6 months. It went up to about, if I'm remembering correctly, it went up to about 16%, and then it dropped in the latter half of the year. So it's come down to about 8 or 9% now. And that's comparable with the Windows dog, right? Which is, as we know, I mean, it's slow and it doesn't do cross-format search. And this is the reason, right? When you actually talk to users, so what we did was we did a series of interviews looking at the instances of where, trying to analyze the cases where search was used. It's people navigate when they can remember where stuff is. And most of the stuff people are trying to find is relatively recent, right? So this isn't to say that search is a total waste of time. It's just it has its place, but it's not, if you like, the universal solution to PIM, because what people are doing in the PIM context is they're browsing for information. OK, so to sum up the kind of negative part of the talk, right? It seems like from a variety of sources that we've been, realistic. I've lost my. There it is. OK. So attempts to just create an archive are not necessarily a solution, because we can see these different problems here. The archive's invisible, it's inaccessible. People sometimes engage in counterproductive organization. And search is not the total solution, right? I mean, as I say, it has a part to play in there, but it's not, I mean, particularly if you think about technology like pictures, it's not going to solve those unfortunate people's search for pictures. OK. So what I now want to do is I want to talk about some systems that we've been building at Sheffield. And I want to think a little bit more about the kind of design principles that we could start using for designing memory repositories, computer-mediated memory repositories that people might actually systematically use. And I want to talk about two approaches to this. The first I've already alluded to is we should think about how these things sit alongside ordinary human memory. So we should think not about replacing, which seems to be the view that a lot of these visions espouse. We should think about trying to extend or sit alongside. The second thing we need to think about is if we're collecting a lot of these types of events in some kind of event stream, we need to think about methods that we can actually use for privileging and choosing and highlighting certain records. Because what you see in the physical realm is a lot of this stuff that's really valuable to people is they've actually repeatedly kind of iterated around and selected, and they've chosen things from among the countless things that you encounter on a daily basis. They're actually selecting and privileging particular things. OK, so I want to talk about a study that we did, which was looking at this notion that these types of organic memories are just substitutes for what goes on inside our head. And one of the assumptions behind a lot of this stuff is, well, you've got this perfect repository. That's something you're always going to use. Well, you sort of think about it for a few seconds, and somebody says to you, well, where do you live? You don't say, just get on the PDA to answer that one, or, I'll just get the sat nav out and, work out exactly where I do live, right? So it's clear that we have organic memories, and that on many occasions it's more efficient to use them. Of course, there are other occasions, as we all know from the kind of list yellow sticky experience, there are lots of times when we actually forget stuff, and we do have to use these types of devices. So what this study was trying to do was to look at what the trade-offs are for people when people actually choose to use their organic memories and when they choose to use these prostheses. And we asked questions which are things like, what are the benefits of using a prosthetic computer-mediated memory compared with organic memory? Perceptions. I mean, so one of the things that we haven't seen discussed is people's impressions of how good their own memory is, right? Because, we all know this situation where, if you're in a couple, couples do this behavior, say, well, don't ask me, ask that person about that. They're the memory person for that kind of thing, right? So people have an idea about the quality of their own memories in relation to memory source, and they will exploit those sources appropriately. And the last thing we're looking at was the device characteristics and asking how does use of a prosthesis depend on the properties of that memory prosthesis. So what we did was a kind of lab-type study. Oh, great, thank you. Okay. Sorry, can't even see this damn thing. Okay. No, I don't. Okay. So we give people memory problems, and we look and see whether or not they use their own heads. This old-fashioned prosthetic device called pen and paper, you've probably heard of it. Dictaphone, which is a verbatim recording of a conversation, for example, and a device that we built called Chitty Chatty. Chitty Chatty works like your notebook there, except it's recording speech. If you point to one of your notes, it'll retrieve the speech that's associated with that note. So it's just time-aligned speech. So if you have the experience, which we all have, which is what did that note mean, then you can just basically click on the note and it'll begin playing back the speech. So I'm not going to show you a demo there, but so what we're interested in is various kind of global properties of the devices and how that affects people's retrieval performance and whether or not they choose to use these devices. So what we can say about organic memory is it may not be very efficient, it may not be very accurate, but it's pretty quick in general compared with looking for something in a dictaphone, for example. So a dictaphone is accurate, but it's pretty inefficient to get information out of it. Pen and paper is quite efficient to scan. It may not be accurate because you might miss elements of the conversation. And if people are interested in note-taking strategies, and I can talk about a lot more about what people do using these types of devices. The device we built, the Chitty Chatty, we hoped was both accurate, because it's got the verbatim record behind the notes, but it's also pretty efficient, because you can scan your notes quite quickly, click on a note, and retrieve the underlying speech. OK, so I won't go through the total design of the experiment, but here are some of the results. So basically what we find is, as you might expect, that if you give people a memory prosthesis, they do better with that than with their own memory, right? And that's their impressions. This is their real behavior. OK, but here's the thing, right? If people use those types of devices, they're less efficient, right? We can discuss that if people are interested in that. But anyway, so you've got something that's better, but it's more time-consuming to use. And then we look and see how those things trade off. This is the Chitty Chatty, right? So this is something that's both efficient and accurate, and people are more likely to use that than something that's just accurate or something that's just efficient, right? And it doesn't look like it. I'm not sure what happened to the error bars here. But actually what was interesting was that people are more likely to use pen and paper, which is inaccurate, than something that's accurate, right? So efficiency is trading off with accuracy here, right? So if we're trying to think about design properties of devices, then we have to think about these types of characteristics. OK, one more thing. The other thing we asked people was we asked people for their confidence that they would be able to remember stuff unaided, right? So we asked them about the quality of their organic memory for a particular. So we showed them a question. We're asking them about something we told them. Then we said, do you think you'll be able to remember that unaided? And then they gave us a response to that, and then we looked at what device they used. What it turns out is that your use of the device is related to your confidence. And this is fairly obvious, but I've not seen it said anywhere in this literature, right? So if you are very confident, you're not going to use an organic memory. You're not going to use a prosthetic memory device, right? If you think you can remember, you don't use such a device. OK, so to sum up these types of studies, you can't assume, as these people have done, that the prosthetic device will always be used. Its use is going to be affected by how good the user thinks their memory for that information will be, unaided, and then various properties of the device, including, for example, its efficiency, and its accuracy. And also, another thing which I haven't had time to talk about is, obviously, we ran these studies at different intervals. As the person's own memory decays, they're more likely to use the device in various ways, right? It also accounts for why you sometimes can't understand your notes after a month. But I can solve that one for you if you're worried about it. So anyway, so the point about these types of studies are that you can build these interesting devices, but they show you can work out some of the properties that the devices ought to have, right, if they're going to be used, and some of the significant characteristics that they should have. OK, so I want to talk now a little bit more about how we might start thinking of abstracting events, significant events, from this stream of things that we're recording using these two types of technologies, these types of technologies. And I want to talk about a theory of memory advocated by John Anderson. And the basic argument here is it's not like we've got a box in our head that's got short-term memory and long-term memory. The argument that he was making was that memory is functional, right? So it's a biological argument. It says we remember the things that relate to the distributional properties of events in our environment. So let's say it in a different way. The most likely predictor of the New York Times headline tomorrow is the New York Times headline today. So that's, say, events in the world cluster. Things that have just happened are more likely to happen again. Plus things that are very frequent are more likely to happen again, and things that are very recent are more likely to happen again. And those are properties of the environment, right? And they come out as being things like properties of memory as well. So we're trying to use this type of information in our systems to try and pre-select particular events that are likely to be significant to people. So let's talk about how we might actually do this type of adaptive selection on all these things that people are experiencing. So you can start thinking about having attention-based accounts for pre-selecting events. So we can pick events and privilege events when those are things that people orient to, right? So we're logging a lot of behavior about people. One way to think about that note-taking application is the person has attended to parts of the speech stream. We know which parts of the speech stream they've attended to, and so privilege those by taking notes so we can see that those are parts of the speech stream that we want to remember. There's a kind of naive theory of photography as well, right? So what you say is, I'm going to the wedding. Out of all the things I'm experiencing today, this is likely to be something that I'm going to remember. I'll attend to it. I'll take some pictures. We want to use those as indices about things that I want to retrieve in the future. And we can do the same thing about attention after the event. So we can say, if you repeatedly access information about something, then that's something as well that you want to privilege, right? Because the fact is you've kept on looking at it, so that's something that we should make to be more important. The other thing, which I probably won't have time to talk about, is that we can actually do analysis of event structure regardless of the user's behavior in terms of its likelihood and frequency, just using IR-type methods. So we can basically say, we can convert, in these recording situations, we can, for example, convert the speech into text, and then we can profile that just in terms of things like IR metrics to look at which were very important, which were frequent terms, which are infrequent in the rest of the language, right? So we can do similar things semantically to privilege particular events automatically. OK, so here are some systems that, I've mentioned two systems. I'm running a series of experiments with my students in Sheffield where students get devices which are like digital notebooks. They listen to the lecture. I record the lecture. It's a podcast. But we've built indices into that lecture based on user behaviors. So in this kind of context, if I had my druthers, you two would have a digital device. You'd be writing your notes. Those notes would become public, and people could use those as an index back into whatever it is that I've said. The other thing we do is we give them a method to take pictures. So again, I don't know whether you've noticed this. This seems very prevalent in conferences now, right? People standing up, taking a picture, instead of taking notes of a slide, by the way, it's not as good as taking notes. I have evidence for that. People take a picture, but that's an index into that event or that memory. So what we do is we give them these types of devices. And so here's some digital notes. What you can do, as you could with the Chitty Chatty, is just click on a particular note if you can't, and then you'll be able to hear what I said about a particular topic after the event. So we've run some course evaluations. I'm not going to go through the details really, but what we can show is that students who are trying to retrieve course materials in quizzes do better if they have these types of tools than when they have, just the slides, just the standard course handout material. This is to scare the students, basically. This shows that what they always say is, oh, now everything's recorded. Do we need to come to lectures? And the answer is, yes, you do. You won't do as well. But anyway. So for those of you who are listening to this after the event, you're not going to do as well. OK. So what we're looking at now is trying to extend this. The obvious extension of this type of thing is to social indexing, right? So you think about this type of setting. The problem with note-taking is that you're trying to do two tasks at once, right? You're trying to think about what is he saying with that strange accent, and at the same time, should I write a note of that? So one of the ways that you can counteract this is you can actually have social indices, which is multiple people are taking notes at the same time, and we can combine these types of notes. What we're doing is we're looking at trying to use social information at retrieval. So here's an example of social information at retrieval. Here's a lecture. And what we do is every time somebody accesses a part of the lecture using one of those indices, you click on an index, you get the speech. Every time somebody accesses one of those, we make it bigger. Right? So what you're doing, this is popularity, basically. So what we're doing is we're popularizing different parts of the lecture using this type of information. And we can do the same thing using both color and bolding on the notes as well. So it would be the bits of your notes that you access most frequently get bolder. OK, so here are some results. Just collected this within the last couple of weeks. So we give people choices they can use. Social versions of the system that have these kind of social feedback incorporated versus the asocial, not a very good term for it, but basically these are individual notes. There's no social information in there. What you see is this is a much more popular system to use. And also what we looked at was kind of within a particular lecture. If somebody comes in and they're doing a retrieval, are they more likely to pick something that's already been picked, i.e. a social index, versus something that hasn't already been picked by somebody? And the answer is that, in general, you see repeated clicks are starting to account for about 60%. So people tend to pick something that somebody else has already picked. OK. I'll just very quickly talk about this stuff. We've been doing some. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, just one question on that is, I understand that people are more want to use the social one. Have you measured whether they do better with it? Are they getting better information, or are they just kind of everyone's getting the same information and it may or may not be as good as what you get using the asocial version?
Yeah, right. So that's I can't answer your question about the social stuff. But one of the things that we've done, I'm just trying to remember the results right now because it's pretty fresh. So one of the things that we did was we correlated people's access behaviors with their end-of-term performance. And I'm just trying to remember what came out. I think there was no relation between using this system and end-of-class performance. But, I mean, the fact we didn't get a relation is not, there are a variety of factors that could explain that. For example, you could get a mixture. So we've, in previous, with pilots, I found that the students who were using this statistically the most were students who were, they were second language speakers, right? And so when we talked to them after the event, what they said is, you talk too quickly. I think this stuff's great. I access it after the event and I re-listen to the lectures, they tended to be the students who didn't do that well on the course. So our original thought was, you know, you use this a lot, you're going to get repeated access to the material, but it's not clear that that's completely the case. So we actually found an inverse correlation. I can look that up for you, but I don't know the answer. But it's not entirely straightforward because I think there are different patterns of use. I mean, the other thing is that this isn't a tool that everybody wants. So if you actually look at, you know, it's a kind of standard power law thing, right? There's a bunch of students who won't use it at all, and then there's another bunch of students who are using it just all the time. So you know, there's a lot of things to explore in that space. So I'm sorry I can't answer your question fantastically well there. Okay, so let me just talk about the meeting stuff, but this is general to ubiquitous speech. So what we do with meeting conversations is that we take speech, we transcribe it to text, and then we just use stupid IR, TF-IDF, on that to profile the terms and the utterances in the document, right? So what we do basically is we privilege the terms which are very frequent in that particular meeting, which are infrequent in the rest of the corpus, right? And we do the same. We say basically that an utterance is just the sum of the importance scores of all the words that occur in that utterance. So we can build summaries, and we can build them in speech, and we can build them in text, right? We've been doing a variety of experiments. So this is the speech data. So what we can do with the speech is people say meetings are really boring, which may be the case, right? So what we can say to people is now we've got an importance profile on a particular meeting. You can listen to that meeting. You can listen to 10%, the most important 10% of that meeting, because we're just using TF-IDF to do that. And we can do various bizarre things like we can drop words, right? So we can say, OK, you know, any stop word is just out, right? Or else we can drop utterances. And we can do mixtures of these various things, like we had a version of the algorithm which is a hybrid where basically what we do is we'd find the most important utterances, and then we'd speed up through the less important utterances. But anyway, the results are pretty encouraging. So what we can show is that that if you ask people to find the most important bits of a meeting subject to some external criterion, then we can show they're more efficient if you drop the less important utterances, and furthermore, interestingly, if you drop the less important words from within an utterance. And this is, I mean, if people are interested, I can play you clips. What's quite striking is you're actually able to work out pretty well what's gone on in the meeting if all these words are dropped, because basically what you're just doing is getting key words. And our argument or analogy is something like when you read text, you're scanning it. You're not, you know, I mean, the results which, the analyses of eye gaze, you know, when you put these, you know, you do the eye gaze detection, shows exactly the same thing. People don't dwell on stop words. People don't dwell on function words. They dwell on content words. And so what this stuff is doing in speech is equivalent to that. OK, so I'm going to just finish up here. So what I want to argue is that we should stop thinking about this kind of view that we want to capture everything. It's just not enough to store everything. There are various problems which are associated with digital archives, that in some sense a lot of the materials are kind of invisible. They're kind of hard to access, and they're also hard to organize. And then we should also think about how to fit these types of technologies alongside what people are good at already. So we should, instead of thinking that these technologies are going to replace human memory, they're going to be in instances where organic memory is poor. So we all know people are bad at remembering intentions, plans, or whatever. Let's start thinking about technologies for that instead of things that we're good at. Let's start thinking about populations who have problems with memory and start targeting them instead of thinking this is going to be a generic solution. The other thing to think about is meta-memory, which is the person's impression of how good their own memory is, because that affects how much these tools are used. Then I talked briefly about different methods of doing selection on all this stuff. We can select off user actions either before the event or after the event, and then we can privilege parts of the event stream using that type of information. And we can also do things based on intrinsic semantics, which is just the distribution of those events in relation to what else we know about the distribution of those events in the world. Okay, so I'll just finish up. I focused mainly on retrieval, but there's a bunch of other types of memory experiences you could think about. You know, what would be a good technology for trying to learn from your past or reminisce about it? And then we also need to think about you know, different types of processors. So I think I alluded to this when I was talking about the Memento study, that, you know, in a sense, you couldn't tell from the properties of the various objects, mementos that people were picking, you couldn't tell precisely why those were so significant to them. So you had to think about the symbolic characteristics of those types of objects. So just thinking about how these relate to episodes in a person's life. And also, we need to think about different types of models for these things. So we need to think about the trade-offs, the costs of creating these types of records. You know, obviously, they're cheaper in the social setting than in the individual setting. Retrieval costs, what we saw was if something may be accurate, but if it's cumbersome to use, nobody's going to use that as a retrieval tool. And also, you know, which you guys all know about, right? Do I trust, you know, the fact that what we saw with what I'm concerned about somewhat with these kind of lecture queuing is, I mean, are the weaker students going to come in, you know, 2 weeks before the class exam and say, oh, well, I'm not going to pay any attention to that, so I'm just going to look at those big images in there, right? So you get, you know, an overfitting which is based on, you know, kind of mob psychology about what was good in that particular course. Okay, so I'll finish there.
First, I want to say thanks to Steve. And we have a little bit of time for questions, so if people can either raise your hands and I'll come to you, or there's a mic in the middle. Are there questions?
We might even have questions, I think.
Ah, yes. Was there a question coming from New York? No? No, okay.
Oh.
All right. These are.
I can be relied upon.
Of course.
So Steve, one of the things that I've been working on for the past couple of years is this whole sense-making model.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of analogies here between, for example, the costs of encoding and the retrieval costs and all that stuff and the standard sense-making thing. So is this the list of costs that you've considered, or have you?
I don't think we've talked about cost in quite a loose way so far. I would not consider this to be a full and complete list of costings. But I'm very interested in the sense-making approach, and I think trying to formalize some of this, I think, is very important. So, no,
Right.
This is just kind of back-of-the-envelope thoughts. But I don't know what thoughts you've got about it.
Well, one of the things you brought up was the how accurate your perception is of the recalled information.
Yes.
And I think that's actually a really important one. And along this encoding cost line, there's also something we've noticed, which is we've been calling it the dread cost, how much you dread the prospective activity of encoding it, right? And so there are interesting costs and sort of meta costs like that. The worry of thinking about how much you're going to be responsible for these notes, or in the social case, how much you might reveal about yourself, or how much you know, and a lot of kinds
Yes.
of things. So there are lots of interlocking, seems to me, kinds of costs and issues that involve here. And so I'm particularly interested in your thoughts about the social interactions in your experience
Within our, so
Yeah,
I
that's
would say that this is relatively recent. So you know, there's some older stuff on you know, pen sharing and distribute, which to my mind was not particularly successful. So I think our stuff is looking to be more successful because there's a greater you need a greater number of participants, I think, to start leveraging social value. We haven't actually done, I think you need to do some kind of post hoc analysis of, you know, sit people down and look and have them discuss their beliefs about the quality of those types of indices. I mean, I will tell you that there are bizarre selection criteria used by students for picking some of these images. You know, so some of the this was kind of the setup slide for the whole of the lecture, right? So in information terms, that's a good thing to pick. This is a person who was close to the person who was taking the images, right? So so you say, well, okay, that's contextual information for that person, but I don't know why socially a lot of people are accessing that particular image. Maybe it's so you may have multiple reasons for certainly in terms of boosting the retrieval side for particular indices to be selected, which may not be informational. So I think it's problematic. We haven't actually done the research on this end to say what the selection criteria are as yet. But I think it's a really interesting space. It's not. I think everybody's in that space right now. Yeah.
So I'm interested in how people shop or do sort of complex information searches and use the web or the physical world as a place to gather information, and what role their own memory or notes or other things play in terms of helping them find the information they need or keep it or make decisions. And so one thing I guess I'm interested basically in what you might be able to contribute to that. One thing I noticed is that this example is an endpoint that you've defined, like the task is to do well in this class, and can you sort of maintain your information in order your memory in order to do well in the class. In shopping, it's kind of like you decide whether you've done a good job or whether with it. And I think the other thing that's interesting about it is that you do something, and then I think sometimes you distance yourself from the information, and something happens in your head. You distance yourself from the external information, and something happens in your head, and then you go back to the external information, and then you have a different relationship to it. So I guess I'm just sort of interested in what you might have to say about these external triggers supporting tasks that you sort of, when you define what success means for that task.
Yeah. So most of our stuff, as you certainly the experimental stuff, we use externally defined criteria. The users in the picture study, we didn't have any clue whether or not we had to just take their word for it. But let me just free-associate to the shopping situation. I mean, one thing that's really striking, this isn't kind of news, is web search is remarkably bad at allowing you to store intermediate results of things that you're doing, right? So, history list, 0.02% of usage, right, according to, and, I was alluding to the fact, like back's a mess now, tabbing's a mess now. So there doesn't seem to be very good support at all for just, trying to collect the results in more than, so you look at the titles of things you've saved in the history list, they're garbage, there's no structure in there. So what you want, and this is not at all trivial, as you know, is you want some kind of abstraction over those set of user behaviors to allow at least partial support there for, some of the processes that people have gone through, maybe using dwell time or something like that, to kind of boost, and can't we do a better job of kind of labeling things? But so I think that's one part of the story. The other part of the story, as far as the user actions are concerned, is it seems curiously hard for people to say about something that they found as part of a kind of interim search or gathering activity. It seems really hard for them to say, this could be useful, right? It seems really hard. And part of the problem is that they're worried about the bookmarks problem. Right? So if you talk to people in that situation, they say, oh, well, I didn't want to save that because look at this mess, right? So it seems like what you want is you want something that's kind of semi-automated that can kind of at least capture, or I don't know whether you want to allow them to index cheaply as well manually, but throw that so that they're not as worried about this accumulation of stuff. Although, because they're not looking at bookmarks, it doesn't matter. It's a bizarre worry. So I think that's part of it. As far as the reflection is concerned, I think this bears a little on the sense making. I don't know really what to think about that. I mean, there's a reminder's perspective for shopping, which I think is, I don't know whether you looked at this Selin, these old style studies with active badges that were done ages ago. And one of the things that I found really striking about that is if you want to kind of remind people, so the problem with sort of saying to people, have you gone to the shops yet, is then, they're not on their way to their shops, right? Either they are, in which case you're wasting their time, or else they're not ready to go to the shop. So you need to know too much about people to be able to remind them about that situation. But I think spatial information might actually be quite useful there, because what that Selin study showed was that people have the most thoughts about things that they ought to do when they're on the stairs, right? So they're moving it. So you might be able to use micro. I don't know whether you can't use GPS for this, right? But you might be able to use micro information about thinking about when you want. I'm not sure whether you were thinking about prompting or thinking about reflection, but I think there's something that you can do in that space, which is based on when people are likely to be busy or not. But you can't do it on the computer, I don't think, because I think it's just unless you're really good at task recognition, which nobody is, right? So.
Okay. So I'm a great fan, advocate, and follower, I guess, of synergy versus substitution. I love the idea that we can augment and empower versus replace. On that note, I've always been curious about this thing of transactive memory when you were speaking earlier, and just the phenomena of like your brain literally mapping information to a source outside of yourself. So when we lose a cell phone or when we break up as a couple, that like it feels traumatic, and actually the brain shows physical trauma. So I see search as something that contributes to transactive memory. I see digital devices that contribute to transactive memory. And I've also been curious about whether or not we live in a generation where we're learning not to remember things because of the phenomena of transactive memory. So I had a friend who sat with his grandfather on his deathbed, and his grandfather was Irish, and said, "You need to know the story of your family." Mm-hmm. And his generation just could recite things and just were able to remember so many things. And our generation, it's difficult for us to remember phone numbers. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just curious about your perspective on that idea of us and digital devices, synergy versus substitution, the idea of something like that versus what we can do to counter or work with transactive memory so that it's not something that debilitates us.
So this is an old, right, so Plato, I think, was the first person to be concerned in this way, because I don't know whether so he basically dissed writing, because writing would stop the tradition of storytelling, because the tradition of storytelling, those Greek myths, they actually held value to that community in the storytelling. You say, well, you write those down, right? People just aren't going to remember them. But I think what the optimistic view of this is that, in a sense, we're freeing people up from, maybe some of the more mundane aspects of, you don't want to say, hey, great, I'm a champion phone number rememberer, right? Nobody is, I guess the CMU students would be, they get a kick out of doing that, right? But, they have, right? Who is it? Ericsson would just have all these students who would just, yeah, right, Bill Chase, right? But that's not something that we kind of want to specialize in, because, but we have to think about how to work with these devices to be able to do that. So I think we move from saying, I can remember that, but to a way that you can actually trace a route to that information. The thing that I don't like about these kind of pure capture models is that the information just seems to now be locked into the device, and that seems to be very different from what people are doing with the physical objects that are talked about, where there's a constant, and this is, they sort of integrate the objects into their lives in quite a significant way. So somebody would say, I'll get the seashells and I'll put them here. You know, I'm going to get the mug and I'll put it here. You know, grandmother's china goes here, right? And so what they're doing is they're taking this stuff from the past and they're weaving it in to how they encounter, you know, into the fabric of their everyday lives. And, you know, that's almost what somebody said, right? But with a lot of these digital technologies, we just plain aren't doing that because, in a sense, we just think we're done when it's inside the device. So what we need to think, so you know, I'm not in general a big fan of ubiquitous computing or augmented, you know, these kind of augmented computing approaches, but I think this is where you can start to think about cases of where you want to try and bring this, you know, into people's everyday lives. And it could be as, you know, as mundane as the shopping experience, right? So I just had, you know, I've got a little theory there about when reminding takes place, but it relies on me knowing about what the person's doing, right? As opposed to kind of locking this stuff up in a device somewhere. I don't know whether I answered your question, but, you know, just the...
It sort of does. I think reinforcing natural behaviors like repetition. I was also wondering whether or not you had an opinion on like cognitive exercises and whether or not assistive devices like this can also actually be designed to improve your memory, like actually do things that rewire your brain to improve your memory.
So I'll tell you, we haven't done any stuff like that, but the Microsoft Cambridge people have some very interesting data with the Alzheimer's, which shows that SenseCam is actually helpful to Alzheimer's patients in terms of helping, you know, so the classic problem is that Alzheimer's patients, they can't remember anything about their day, and their self-esteem just drops, you know, because basically, you know, that's, you know, you are your memories in some sense. And so what they've done, and what the classic medical treatment is, or a part of the kind of cognitive treatment for Alzheimer's is you have people make diaries, right? And then this is the cost of making a diary is just prohibitive, right? And they might forget to make the diary. So here we have is this, you know, low-cost, automatically generated record, right? And what that shows is that they can remember more events, right? Even without the triggers. So they run two, you know, you can show them the pictures, or you can ask them, you know, that can't be true. That can't be true. But anyway, the result I do remember is the self-esteem went way up as a result of this. So I think there's something in this space that can really, you know, can actually help. But the design is absolutely crucial, right? Just has to be.